Hi, I'm Blair Glennon from the Darden School of Business, and we're here today to talk a little bit about SQL. The purpose of this entire series is to introduce you to SQL, or SQL, but in this particular video, we'll be setting up MySQL, an open source version of this particular language. While we set up the environment, we'll kind of talk through some of the basics of SQL and why it's important to use this language, but the rest of this series will actually cover more details of what we start to cover here. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to cut over to my laptop. And so what we have here is a computer that has never had SQL installed on it. We're going to start from the MySQL install page. Now on here, we want to go down and install the larger of the two files. This one's 320 megs. It's version 5.713. You'll click download and we'll say go ahead, no thanks, just start my download, no need to log in or sign up for anything. The network here is pretty fast, but just to save some time, I'm going to go ahead and cancel it because I have this download file already on my desktop. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up, and Windows is going to run through this process of checking requirements. It's going to ask us a couple questions along the way. Go ahead and get to the first point where we get a user prompt of the SQL installer. Okay, so the first thing this SQL installer is going to ask you is what type of setup we want to use. We want to use the developer default. We'll cover what it means by server only, client only a little later, but the important things that we want to make sure are installed in this default is MySQL Server and MySQL Workbench. MySQL Workbench is the interface that you're actually going to be working in for most of your SQL work. So let's go ahead and hit next. And what you should see here is conflicts that MySQL installer finds. I mentioned that MySQL Workbench is an important thing for this process. So if you see MySQL Workbench in here, we need to go ahead and address that issue. Some versions of the installer, you can see this error here. It'll say MySQL Workbench, Microsoft Visual C++ 2013 runtime distributable is required. If you get this screen and that's there, you need to go download that file. What it looks like when you install the Visual C++ 2013 redistributable is like this. You go ahead and install that and run through it. My computer has that file installed, so MySQL isn't complaining, and we'll go ahead and continue. So I'll hit next, and you ignore the things that we're not going to use: MySQL for Excel, Visual Studio, and Connector Python. So these are all the programs that it's going to install. The important things here: SQL Server and the SQL Workbench. And then for connecting with other programs like R or other languages like R, we need the ODBC connector. So let's go ahead and execute this. So while that's installing, and it could take any variable length of time, I've cut over to a PowerPoint presentation that we can kind of talk through the slides at the various cut points here. So the first thing we want to cover is kind of the basics of what is SQL. SQL or SQL stands for the Structured Query Language. Basically, the purpose of SQL is to interact with a relationship database management system, an RDBMS. Basically, what SQL allows you to do is efficiently retrieve, create, update, and delete data. It takes data management a step further beyond what Excel can do, and allows you to do a variety of things that we'll cover later in this series. So, the installer should be running in the background. If your installer isn't finished at this point, go ahead and pause this video and let it complete. But I think that mine is done, so I'm going to jump back over to it. And sure enough, you should have all green check marks here. If any of these failed, you should stop the install process and check with tech support to make sure that you have the key components installed, specifically SQL Server, Workbench, and if you're going to connect to a different language like R, the ODBC connector. So let's move ahead in the install process. The next step is to configure MySQL Server. So we're going to do this. We're going to hit next. And what we're doing is we are setting up a server instance on our local computer. It's not connecting to a server in the cloud. In a development environment, it's going to live on your local machine, and your user interface that you interact with, that workbench, is going to talk to the server that's actually sitting on your computer. So it's going to connect through a port locally to your machine, and we're going to go ahead and hit next. Here, you need to set a password. It's very important that you don't forget this password because, well, we're going to cut back there. Go ahead and hit next. Here we need to set a password so that your computer knows that it's going to, nope. So we'll go ahead and hit next. Here we need to set a password for SQL Workbench to talk to the server. Root is the super user in a lot of computer languages, so we're going to set a root password to the super user or administrator password. So just so you can see what my password is here, it's going to be let's call it heart SQL exclamation point. We'll copy that so you guys can see it, copying it in here, and then making it twice. It's going to say that the password strength is weak unless you pick a really strong password, but that's fine. You're not really exposing yourself to external networks right here as long as it's living on your local machine. So let's go ahead and hit next. So at this point, we're configuring the Windows service. The server starts when your computer starts, and we want it to be called something like MySQL 5.7. The defaults are fine. It's going to run as the standard system account, and we'll go ahead and jump through this. We're going to not enable a document store. But at this point, we have our second break here. I'm going to save my password, and I'm going to hit execute and jump back over to the second slide in our presentation here. Okay, so while that's installing, let's talk a little bit about why we use SQL and relational databases. Basically, relational databases are really good at efficiently storing large amounts of data. They use less space than normal text files, and they also allow multiple users to read and write data at the same time. You can grant different permissions for different users. That's not really applicable in our instance because we have one user on one computer, but you should know that this is why it's used in enterprise settings. And finally, it uses less computation time to actually start filtering through large amounts of data. Now, relational databases store many records in different text types or different string types like text or numbers. And they store it across multiple tables, which are connected by key columns, either a primary key or a foreign key that allow the tables to be joined together. Now, why do we use SQL instead of Excel? Well, Excel could do the same stuff, but it would get ugly, it'd run out of space, and it would probably crash all the time. Now, I'm going to jump back over to my install process, which should be done. Great. In your install process, you may have noticed a couple of Windows messages popping up saying we're starting services, we're stopping services. As long as all of these guys are green and you have apply server configuration as finished, you should be good to continue on. So we'll go ahead and finish this process, and it returns us back to the main SQL installer saying our configuration of the server is complete. Let's go ahead and test that connection. So this is that password that I entered earlier, the iHeartSQL. We'll go ahead and check it. It says, oh, connection was successful. Our server is started, and we're ready to continue. So I'll hit next. And we have the same apply server configuration dialog. And during this process, I'm going to hit execute, and we'll talk a little bit more about the relational database management system. So execute. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about relational databases and how they work. So relational databases typically contain multiple tables. A database schema kind of shows you how the tables are connected to each other, and it's a great way to understand how you can retrieve data from the different tables. So in this sample, I'm going to zoom in a little. We have 4 tables that contain customers, orders, order details, and products. What you have is a one-to-many relationship between customers. One customer can order multiple orders, and one order could have multiple details. Those details could contain multiple products. And so what you can do is join these tables together based off of product ID to product ID, order ID to order ID, and customer ID to customer ID, which would allow you to ultimately determine what did customer 1, 2, 3 order in here. You can pull it together with the products. You can say the product name, maybe who the supplier was of the products, all things that would cause a lot of data replication if you were stored into a Excel spreadsheet or some other form. So that's what a relational database is really good at. So let's jump back over to the installer. It should be done. Great, we're all green. So we'll go ahead and finish out this installation. And it's going to ask if you should it's going to prompt you to start SQL Workbench after the setup. Let's go ahead and finish and see SQL Workbench. Okay, so SQL Workbench is here. I'm going to go ahead and maximize this window so you can see. We have the local instance of MySQL installed. You can see it's on that port that I was talking about a little bit earlier. We're hitting localhost at a particular port. And when we want to connect to it, we go ahead and open it up. Now this is where we use that password that we have created and connect. And if you want to save your password in your vault, it's probably a good practice so you don't have to type it over again. But you should remember that password because it is very difficult to change once the process is set up. So this is the default MySQL Workbench. This is a database. What we can do is we can select, and we'll cover what select means in later videos, but we'll select hello world from the database. First thing that you typically do in a new language is say hello to the world. And there we go. We have our SQL saying hello world. Now, it's worth noting that you have to be connected to the SQL server in order to run something. So I'm going to save that little test script off to my desktop and show you what happens if you aren't connected to a server when you try to run something. So we'll close out of everything. We don't need that nifty password anymore. I'll open up my test.sql file that I just saved because it's the first time. Let's go ahead and make MySQL Workbench the default program to handle SQL files. And then it should open up. And what we have here is an unconnected session. So if I hit select hello world, we get nothing. Nothing happens because we're not connected to a database. You see not connected. In order to make that work, what you need to do is you need to close out of this process, and then let's open up SQL Workbench. And then connect to it. You should connect here. And then if you want to, if that file wasn't already open waiting for you, you could open it either through your recent ones, or you could open the SQL script and navigate through Windows to that file location. And there you go. Select hello world again works, it returns something, and you're good to go. So with that, SQL Workbench is installed. We're going to move on to something a little bit different, and we're going to set up the ODBC connection for MySQL to connect to other languages. So in order to install the ODBC adapter, let's go ahead and open up Administrative Tools under the Control Panel. So in here, we will go to ODBC connections, and if you have a 64-bit computer, let's do that. Let's add a new one, and we're going to use the MySQL ODBC 5.3 ANSI driver. We'll hit Finish. Our data source name, let's call it a local connection. Our TCP/IP server is 127.0.0.1. That's just the location of your local host, and it's that same port 3306 we set up earlier. And remember, the only user we have set up right now is root, or our super user, and then we're going to enter that password that you should have retained, I heart SQL exclamation point, and then we go ahead and hit OK. At this point, the connection should be set up, so let's go ahead and open it up and just test it real quick. Connection successful. At this point, you have an open ODBC server or open ODBC connection on your computer for other languages to connect to. So with that, I want to thank you for spending some time learning a little bit about SQL. The rest of the series will cover a lot of the topics that I started to touch on, like what is a query and how does it actually work. We'll cover a little bit of that, and then we'll move into some more advanced topics. So hope you enjoyed it, and good luck with SQL.